Now that Malian and French troops have retaken the north, the question remains about what will happen with ethnic Tuaregs whose home lies in that region. Tuareg rebels launched the rebellion, then split with the Islamists, and while Mali's president said he won't negotiate with other militant groups, he will join dialogue with the Tuaregs, who have fought for decades for more autonomy in the region. But then, who are the Tuaregs? What are their grievances? To offer insight into this and other questions, we're joined by Professor Kwaku Nuamah, an assistant professor of international peace and conflict resolution at American University, and Scott Stearns, Voice of America's State Department correspondent. But first, we want to go to Professor Pierre Boilley, a noted African expert who is joining us by phone from Paris. Professor Boilley, are you on the line? Okay, we don't have Professor Boilley at the moment, so I want to stay here in the studio. Professor Kwaku, I first want to ask you, if you go back a little bit into history, when did the Tuaregs start having problems with the government in Bamako, and what have really been their grievances?
Well, the problem, as with most of these types of problems in Africa, goes back to the pre-colonial era. And as you are aware, the Sahel has different sociocultural institutions from the parts of Africa below that belt. And the Tuaregs had always hoped that they were going to have something sort of their own state. And the French colonial experience was uneven. They basically neglected the northern part of Mali, and the thinking was that they were going to have their own state. They have grievances. The north is underdeveloped, and then at independence, the Bambara elites were allowed to take over the state, and they incorporated the north. And it's never been fully part of the country, and there's always been problems there with, that there's a racial component to this discussions with the Tuaregs being seen as light-skinned, slaveholders, and the Southerners being seen as being black Africans who were lazy and all sorts of things. 1963 is when the big explosion occurred. Yeah. And the government's response, the post-colonial government's response to that problem was not to negotiate, but to actually use coercion and to use suppression. And that forced a lot of the Tuaregs to migrate, to flee into Libya and to Algeria. And then, of course, we go to the 70s and the 80s when drought affected the region and actually destroyed the socio-economic infrastructure in the region.
Okay. Professor Nuamah, I want to get in also a comment from Professor Pierre Boilley. Are you on the line now from Paris?
Yes, bonjour.
Bonjour. Now, Professor Boilley, we've talked a little bit about the history of the Tuaregs in Mali. Give us a sense of how did the rebellion of the Tuaregs become bigger and even more vicious in the last few months?
Yes, I think so, because it's not the first rebellion. There was one in 63, 64, it was not a big rebellion, but a big repression of the Malian army. There is another one in 19th century years, well, very important, but there is no revendication of independence. It was really an integrated desire. The Tuaregs wants to be Malian, really. And now there is the new rebellion is bigger than the others because they have a lot of arms, modern weapons, and they have some revendications of independence. It's not really the same this day, but it was a real war, and independence was a very important revendication.
Now, very briefly, in the historical context, to what extent has religion been a factor? Now that we saw in the recent past, there have been also other groups that have used religion to join up arms with the Tuaregs.
For the Tuaregs, there is absolutely no religious revendication. In all the rebellions, the religion was not on the prime level. There are Muslims, but that's all. And the revendication of a little part of Tuareg was the revendication of Iyad Agrali, who was converted to Salafism in the end of the 19th years. But that's all. The impact of the Salafism is only for Akmi, Aqim, and Mujao and Ansardin, but absolutely not for the MNLA.
Thank you very much, Professor Pierre Boilley. He joined us by phone from Paris in France. And I want to turn to Professor Nuamah here in the studio. Professor, you know, so much has been happening in the last few months. What I want to ask you is, what are the most important factions among the Tuaregs? We know that all these groups, somehow they have different names, but some of them really belong to the Tuareg people.
Well, you can categorize them into two. There's the non-jihadist groups, the MNLA, which actually started this rebellion, this current phase of rebellion, and then you have the jihadist groups, you know, Ansardin being the main one, and Mujao, and then of course now Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb coming in and supporting that. So these are the factions, and you can talk to the MNLA because they don't have this jihadist agenda. But as we know today, the interim president is demanding that as a precondition for negotiation, they should reject, they should denounce the request for secession because it's trying to keep the territorial integrity.
That brings us to the question, the fact that the North is also composed of Arabs. They're the Songhai, they're the Fulani people. Now the question is, there consensus between like all these people on what is the best way really to resolve that issue?
There isn't consensus, and that's the problem. In the past, there's been agreements. Even Ansardin, you can negotiate with them because you know, Iyad Agrali was part of the 1991 agreement and also the 2006 agreement. So you can negotiate with them. What's different now is that you have the return of radicals who were part of Gaddafi's Islamic Legion coming in, and of course they are dominating the fight, and with Al-Qaeda coming into the picture, it becomes the new frontier on the war on terror, and that becomes a complicated situation.
Now let me turn quickly to our State Department correspondent, Stearns. Scott, you know, there's been questions being asked, to what extent can the U.S. actually give support to either France or the Malian government in this situation?
Well, I think containing this problem becomes an issue of securing the elements that have fled the French advance inside Mali, preventing them from moving into Algeria, which involves working with the Algerians, and preventing them from crossing the border into Niger, which is obviously part of the military cooperation between the United States and Niger that was concluded just this week. A large part of that responsibility will fall not only to Nigerian forces, but to Chadian forces who are entering this conflict from Niger.
Well, thank you very much, Scott, for standing by there. And I really want to thank our guests on this segment, Professor Pierre Boilley, who joined us from Paris in France, Professor Kwaku Nuamah of American University, and VOA State Department correspondent Scott Stearns for joining us today. Now, for a longer look at the Tuareg question, go to our website, voaafrica.com.